key kind of aims for this course is to try and develop a methodology, a way of approaching reading the Bible. We've been looking at this idea throughout the course. So first of all, we come to the task of reading. That involves interpreting, and that's difficult. And it involves three agents: the reader, the text, and the author. And we've been developing that idea throughout this course. And last week we tried to apply that to thinking about eternal life and salvation. Thinking about ourselves as readers, what we're bringing to the text, looking at the various voices we hear within our library, and then finally trying to bring them together with and through Jesus, through the Jesus filter. So we're going to do that again this week, but in a slightly different way. I'm trying to teach you kind of different ways of using this kind of model, this idea of thinking about reader, text and author. We're going to, first of all, as is always appropriate, think of ourselves as readers, think about our approach, how we're coming to the text, what we're bringing. And then we're going to think about the author, think about the Jesus filter, look specifically about how Jesus encounters and relates to women. And then finally we're going to look at some what I would call tricky or problematic texts that might raise some questions for us, and try and read them in light of what we see in Jesus. Read them in light of the Jesus filter. So that's the plan for today. So, first of all, I've got a couple of questions for you about the reader. So this is focusing, if you remember, that we have three attitudes for us as readers. Thinking about humility, thinking about honesty and openness. These two questions focus on honesty. What are we bringing to the text? Being honest about our own presuppositions, backgrounds, baggage. So just two very brief questions to discuss with your neighbour. What did you grow up hearing about the role of women in the church? And what were you told the Bible said about the role and place of women? Just to think a little bit about the background, the place that we might have come from in the past, no matter where we are now. So a couple of minutes just to chat to your neighbour about those two questions. So that's, first of all, thinking about the reader. The author. I'd like us to think about Jesus. And we always start with Jesus. This is again how we're thinking about reading the Bible. We begin with Jesus. We think about him, and then we think about finding the word, Jesus Christ, in the words. We think about reading everything else through Jesus. So we begin with him. So two questions. What stories can you think of where Jesus encounters women, and how does Jesus treat women? I suppose that's kind of 1.5 questions really, moulded into one. So stories where Jesus encounters women, and how does he treat women? Just chat about that with your neighbour for a few minutes, if you would. Think of where Jesus encounters women, and in those stories, how does Jesus treat them? Any stories that people thought of? Okay, brilliant. So from John 4, the Samaritan woman at the well. And how does Jesus treat that woman?
With respect.
With respect, yeah. Yeah, he breaks all sorts of social conventions. He shouldn't have been talking to this woman at all, really. And yet there he is in the middle of the day talking to this Samaritan woman at the well. Yeah, absolutely. What other stories did we think of?
Mary Magdalene.
Okay, yeah, Mary Magdalene. Which encounter?
Oh.
Which story were you thinking of?
Stephen?
We thinking of the perfume and on Jesus' feet? Okay, great. So Mary Magdalene comes in, pours perfume on Jesus' feet, or head, depending which version you read, and the people he's eating supper with say, this woman should be got rid of. She's basically a prostitute. She's a sinner. Get her out. And Jesus says, no, this is good. Refuses to exclude her, refuses to outcast her. Any other stories people thought of?
The widow's mite.
The widow's mite, yeah, the widow's offering, yeah. So Jesus looks at this widow and says, look at this widow giving 2 pence. Actually, she's giving more than this rich Pharisee man. Yeah. Any other stories?
Martha and Mary.
Martha and Mary. Okay, so sitting down with Mary. I was getting confused. Mary, whilst Martha's busy, talking to them, including them. Yeah, clearly part of his close-knit group of followers, of friends, which again was remarkable for that day. Yeah. Any other stories?
Woman was hemorrhaging.
Yeah, the woman who's hemorrhaging. Okay, so again, Jesus treats her with utmost respect. So, who touched me, brings her forward, which is quite scary, but also is a way of bringing her back into community. This woman who was excluded, who was unclean for 13 years because of her bleeding, is suddenly brought back into community, loved and cherished. Yeah, excellent. There are more, which I'll mention a few. I'm going to now talk a little bit about what I see in Jesus, bringing out some of the things we've just been chatting about, and before then suggesting a way for us to get something out of difficult texts. When I put a questionnaire out to people around reading the Bible, one of the questions that people came back to me with was, I don't know what to do with a lot of text. So I read something and I think, how does that apply to my life? Okay, so we're going to look at some quite strange texts today from the Bible and try and think, how do I get something out of this? How do I hear God's voice in these strange texts? So first of all, I'm going to look a little bit about Jesus, thinking about this Jesus filter, how we might read the rest, and then try and apply that to think about how we then might read some strange and tricky texts. And then I'm going to ask you guys to have a go. I hope that sounds all right. So, better turn this on, because I haven't yet. Sorry, so sorry. Okay, there we go. Right, so, let me tell you what I see in the stories of Jesus. So as I read the Gospels, I see the figure of Jesus presenting a radically new idea about the role and place of women in the church and in his new kingdom and in society. So we see, of course, Jesus speaking to the woman at the well, breaking numerous social conventions. We see him being merciful to the women caught in adultery. So from John 8, so what hasn't just been mentioned. When they brought just the woman to Jesus to be stoned. The man, they'd just forgotten about him, they didn't care about him, but they brought the woman to be stoned. The easy target, if you like. But Jesus, of course, has compassion and lets her go. We see Jesus including women as his disciples. It was women who surrounded him and provided material support for him and his followers in his mission. We see them being the ones who followed him right to the cross, whilst Peter and others abandoned him. We see Jesus appearing first of all after his resurrection to women, even though their testimony was not considered valid at that point in time. Still, they became the first missionaries, the first witnesses to his resurrection. So the position of women was radically altered by Jesus. More specifically, though, we can see the Jesus filter that we've been talking about in previous weeks coming together as we think about Jesus and his encounters with women. So we see the priorities where Jesus focuses and includes victims, focuses on the outcast. We see the priorities around peace, around life and love come together in Jesus' encounters with women. First of all, in the Roman Empire, women and children were the victims and the oppressed. But in Jesus, we see something different. We see Jesus standing beside women, standing with the victims of an unjust society. We see that in the story of the woman caught in adultery. We see it in the story of the widow's offering. We see it in the story of Mary pouring perfume on him and not being pushed aside, standing with the victims and oppressed of society. We also see him building a community of peace, that second priority around this Jesus filter, where all were welcomed as equals, where the old categories of race and gender and social status simply didn't matter anymore. He crosses those social barriers in talking to the Samaritan at the well, in healing the daughter of the Syrophoenician woman, in simply letting women be part of his followers, part of his entourage. And finally, the third part of this Jesus filter that we've talked about, we see Jesus seeking to offer life and love to all in abundance, not restricting it to a few, to people in certain positions with certain power or social status, or of a certain gender, but enabling all to flourish and fulfill their calling in this new kingdom. Now that is really unusual. In his context, only men became followers of rabbis. And yet here, we have women also being invited to be followers of this rabbi, followers of this very different, strange rabbi, ushering in this new kingdom. Of course, we see that most of all when women become the first evangelists, the first witnesses to the resurrection. So there, in all of those encounters, we see the Jesus filter coming together. These priorities we see in Jesus of focusing on the victim, of building communities of peace, and a drive towards life and love. In some other parts of the New Testament, we see this radical new agenda being pursued as well. You could say that the first apostles put this Jesus filter on over their eyes and began to think about what the church might look like through this Jesus filter. So quite radically, we meet Phoebe. A church leader. Good morning, do you join us? We meet Priscilla, the wife of Aquila, who together were regarded as Paul's fellow workers. We meet Junius, who was seen as an apostle. And we also hear some theological reflection on the stories of Jesus, some reflection on what this Jesus filter might mean for the church. And so we hear in Galatians 3:28, you might know this verse, that there is no longer Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female, but all are one in Christ. So in that verse, we see the radical equality that Jesus sets up in his new kingdom being brought to bear on the thinking of the early church. Paul was thinking, what does the church look like through this Jesus filter? Thinking through Jesus, what should the church look like? However, as many of you will be aware, the New Testament is a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to what it says about the place and role of women. Some parts of our New Testament library pursue what we see in Jesus. They try to work out what it might mean for this Jesus filter to influence how the church looks. But there are other voices present in the New Testament as well. And I hope that doesn't come as any surprise to us, having been on this journey together, understanding that our sacred scriptures are a library with many voices being heard coming through the pages. So there are other voices as well, conservative voices if you like, which maintain the cultural laws of the day. So we see and hear Paul talking about this idea that we have no other custom in the church. Therefore, for example, it's right for women to remain silent. That's just what happens everywhere. Or from 1 Corinthians 11, he says that women should have long hair. And he just says, well, that's just the order of things. That's just natural, isn't it? It's just obvious, isn't it? He's just kind of taking what's accepted within his own society, within his culture, and putting that onto the church. So those voices present a vision for the church which doesn't seem to have been so impacted by the Jesus filter, which don't seem to have realised that Jesus presents a radical new way of thinking when it comes to the place and role of women. These voices just echo the noise around them, echo the society around them, offering conservative positions which actually are explicitly trying to just fit in with the contemporary culture. Paul makes it quite clear. He says, well, we should do this because that means we'll be respected by outsiders. Outsiders won't think we're too odd and strange and unusual. This is just the way of things in the world. This is just what makes sense best. A conservative voice echoing what was going on in culture. So, to summarise. So far, we've thought about the stories we have in our Gospels, where Jesus encounters women. And in them, we see the priorities of the Jesus filter come together. We have seen this Jesus filter impact then some of the thinking in the early church. Some of the apostles put this Jesus filter on and thought, what might that mean for how the church should look? We see that in some of the New Testament. But in other parts of the New Testament, we hear other voices which create dissonance with what we see and hear in Jesus. So we are left then to consider these dissonant voices, not just in the New Testament, but also in the Old Testament as well. So we've started with Jesus. That's where we always have to start our reading from. We've then put this Jesus filter on. We read the rest of the pages through him. We try and read the rest of the Bible, trying to find the word within the words, trying to find God's voice in all of these voices. We read the rest of the Bible through Jesus. And that's what we're going to try and do now, particularly looking at some tricky passages around women, and think about what might it mean to find God's voice in these texts. What might it mean to read these texts through the Jesus filter? And I'm going to suggest 3 ways of doing it. And then I'm going to hand over to you guys to have a go at doing it in practice. So, 3 ways of trying to read all of our texts in our great library through the Jesus filter. First of all, I want to suggest that some texts act like a mirror for ourselves, for the church, and for our society. Right? So we need to face up, first of all. We need to be honest about the fact that in our sacred library, there are many texts that reveal the inferiority, subordination, and abuse of women in ancient Israel and in the early church. We have to own that. We have to be honest about that is true for a lot of our sacred library. But accepting that, we can then begin to use the texts as a mirror, asking questions about ourselves, our church, and our society. We might read a story in the Old Testament that is hard to stomach, a story where women are victimised and oppressed. Our first reaction to that story might be to think, thank goodness we are no longer like that. Thank goodness we've seen the light and we don't do things like that anymore. But then perhaps we hear the voice of God speaking to us, saying, are you sure? Are you sure that you, the church, the society, have actually moved on? Could it be that you are much more like this ancient patriarchal society than you thought? One text that seems to oppress women could hold a mirror up to us, force us to look carefully at our own society, church, or lives, and think, actually, maybe we're just like this. Maybe we're no different. I want to break that down and think about how that might happen for society, for the church, and for ourselves. So, we might read a text which seems to oppress women and holds a mirror up to our society. We might read it and hear God speaking to us maybe about how rife domestic abuse against women still is, or speaking to us about the fact that globally 1 in 4 women have been sexually harassed at some point in their life. We might end up thinking about the everyday sexism campaign in this country that you might have heard about, and begin to see just how embedded this kind of sexism is in our society and in some of our scriptures. So an ancient text that seems to oppress women suddenly helps hold a mirror up to us and our society, helps us to see our society in a new light under the judgment of God. Another text might help us consider the state of the church. We might, for example, read a text which suggests the most important thing for women is childbearing. That is true for a number of texts, particularly in the Old Testament. Our first reaction after reading such a text might be to thank God that because of Jesus, we now know that what matters most is being children of God. What matters most is spiritual birth, not natural birth. And that would be a good and fair response to that text. But we might also be led by the Spirit to consider the idolisation of family in the modern church. The Spirit might open our eyes to see that often in churches, it's those with a perfect family, those with 2.4 children, that are the ones leading at the centre of things, whilst others that don't fit that pattern are sometimes pushed to the fringe. Now, I hope and pray that doesn't happen in this church, but I know for a fact that that is a trend, and that in some churches, the family, the nuclear family, is idolised. We might read a text, in particularly the Old Testament, which sees the most important thing for children as childbearing, which holds a mirror up and forces us to see clearly the own problems of our church today. We might also perhaps read a text which suggests women should return to an abusive relationship. There are again a number of texts which suggest that in the Old Testament and New Testament. And then be led by the Spirit to consider how the church has been and often is complicit in keeping women in situations of abuse. The text might judge us, might hold a mirror up to us to see the issues and problems with our own church. It forces us to take a good, long, hard look at ourselves and see our own church practices reflected in the text. Practices which might be in dire need of being overhauled. So that's the text holding a mirror up for the society, for the church, and also it might hold a mirror up for ourselves as individuals. It might make us consider our own attitudes and behaviours. We might, for example, read a text that screams of patriarchy, that dismisses women as nothing more than the property of men. And then perhaps I as a man need to hold a mirror up and ask to what extent I emulate these attitudes. We might think we have moved on, but have we? The text then can act like as a mirror for society, for the church, for ourselves. And the key word here is always repentance. We see our own practices, our own shortcomings, our own failures in the text. We are judged by the text, if you like, and are called to change, forced to change our practice. So that's the first way, I think, these tricky texts, these difficult texts, which jar with the Jesus filter, which jar with what we see in Jesus, can be read, finding God's voice in them. The second two ways that I want to suggest are much shorter. So second, it might be, and this is a much more positive way of looking at a text, it might be that some texts have voices that foreshadow Jesus and the radical equality that we see in his new kingdom. So it might be that one text disrupts the standard patriarchy of the Old Testament. We might hear a whisper that reveals Jesus to us, a voice that challenges the sexism we find elsewhere. It might be even that embedded in a text that is full of patriarchy, that's loudest voice, if you like, is oppression and victimization. We might even within that text find something positive. For example, we might come across a law which, whilst taking patriarchy for granted, whilst maybe even assuming that a wife is the property of a husband, it actually provides protection for women within that context. Protection for women who might otherwise be even more vulnerable in that context. So hidden then, within that text, which might assume oppression, victimization even, there might also be a faint voice that begins to speak to Jesus and his new kingdom, that points us forward to the Jesus who is always standing with the victims and the outcasts and the oppressed of society. We should be listening out for those voices. What can we see that's positive in the text, if you like? What points forward to what we see in Jesus Christ? So one, a text might act as a mirror. And that's, if you like, a more negative way of looking at the text. We see oppression and victimization in the text, and we hold a mirror up to our own lives, our own society, as we see that still, what we see in the text is still happening today. More positively, a text might foreshadow Jesus and the radical equality that we see in him. And thirdly, it might be that a text resonates with someone's story today. Perhaps someone reads the story of Hagar. So Hagar, if you don't know, was Sarah's slave. Abraham and Sarah, from the book of Genesis, they're promised a son. It doesn't happen straight away. Abraham then goes and has sex with Sarah's slave Hagar to produce a son. She has a son, Ishmael, and then Sarah hates Hagar and Ishmael and sends her away into the wilderness. That story, a story of being cast out, a story of feeling rejected even by God himself, a story of everything going wrong with no happy ending to speak of. Hagar just disappears from the pages of Scripture. There is no happy ending to her story. Someone might read that story and see themselves in it. It might give them the words to begin speaking of their own experience. It might enable them to know that they are not alone, that others have felt similar things, have gone through similar situations. Stories in the Bible of oppression and victimization might help people to begin to process, help give them the words to think through what they themselves have gone through. So that's 3 ways that I think we can hear God's voice in these tricky voices. Find the word within the words. Hear God speaking to us, even in these tricky texts. 3 ways of reading tricky texts through the Jesus filter, through Jesus. Seeing texts as a mirror for our society, our church, and ourselves. Hearing in the text, more positively, that whisper that foreshadows Jesus. And thirdly, perhaps for some people, finding their own story in the text, a way to process and talk about their own story. 3 possible ways of hearing God's voice in these tricky texts. Reading these texts through Jesus.